So as you can see, the pieces were in place at the dawn of the age of the horseless carriage, and the first true automobile manufacturer in St. Louis was the St. Louis Motor Carriage Company. This is a shot of their factory and two of their very early vehicles outside of the factory. The factory opened on Thanksgiving Day 1898, and the vehicles were said to be quite durable, and it was an early success. This was one of the brochures from the St. Louis Motor Carriage Company. You can see their famous slogan, "Rigs that Run." This was said because they were such durable, well-built machines. And this is a shot of the senior leadership of the St. Louis Motor Carriage Company. In the back seat of the vehicle are Jesse French Sr. and one of his sons, who were officers of the company. The driver is someone whose name has become very, very important in St. Louis automotive history, George Preston Doris, who was the chief engineer for the company, and some would say the mechanical genius behind its success. The St. Louis Motor Carriage Company lasted for about 6 or 7 years. Unfortunately, one of the sons was killed in, ironically, a vehicle accident, and the company eventually moved to Peoria, Illinois, and unfortunately by 1906 it was gone. So the first automobile maker in St. Louis was briefly successful, but then was gone fairly quickly. However, George Preston Doris remained.
You can see here, not only did George Preston Doris remain, he actually founded the Doris Motor Car Company and expanded the offerings from what had originally been part of St. Louis Motor Carriage. In his new company, he offered not only really fantastically well-engineered and built automobiles, he also offered commercial trucks. You can see here a 3.5-ton change-driven truck that the Doris Motor Car Company used for advertising. As it says right there on the truck, built to a standard, not down to a price. That was the most well-known sayings of the Doris Motor Car Company, and it epitomized their offerings very well. You can see an example here of the 680 sedan, the Touring. This was a very popular model for the Doris Motor Car Company in the late teens into the early 20s. Again, built for style, durability, and performance, certainly not down to price. You could have bought several Model Ts for what it would have cost you to buy one of these, but the vehicle certainly paid back in performance. Here's an example of old and new in one of the original Doris Motor Company buildings located off of Faust Park Avenue near Sarah. Where the Dorises were originally built, CIC at CET, one of the tech groups here in St. Louis now, is helping program autonomous vehicles driven by computer, not humans. I'm not quite sure what George Doris would think of that being his building now, but here we are well over a century later after he was building the same building.
And here's George P. Doris again in the back seat with the white cap on at the Texas State World's Fair in the mid-1940s. He's riding in a 1902 St. Louis vehicle, one of the old St. Louis Motor Carriage vehicles, and to his left is another famous name in St. Louis automotive history, Andrew Lee Dyke. Andrew Lee Dyke and Doris were longtime friends and traveled around the country in an old St. Louis in the 40s. Dyke, on the other hand, was also an entrepreneur and inventor and self-publisher. He and Doris jointly created the first float-feed carburetor. You can see a picture of it here, which has been at the Smithsonian Institute for many, many years, and is said to have paved the way toward the dominance of gasoline for automobile motivation. This is a shot of Andrew Lee Dyke's supply company display at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. As you can see, there are lots of automobile supplies, including clothing and parts and manuals and all sorts of things there. There's a female mannequin there, all dressed for a ride in the country in a horseless carriage, and it is said that the expression was all dyked up when one was ready for a drive in a horseless carriage, and that eventually came to be all decked out. Dyke's claim to fame, or one of them, was that his was the first automobile supply company in the United States. However, he sold that early in the 1900s and then moved on to self-publishing. And he published several automobile manuals, including this one called Diseases of the Gasoline Automobile and How to Cure Them by Dr. Dyke. Now, one more interesting fact about Andrew Lee Dyke was that in creating these manuals over nearly a 50-year span, he amassed a wealth of automotive materials, brochures and guidebooks and manuals and dealer materials and so on. And near the end of his life, he decided to divest himself of all these materials. And when he did, they went to the Detroit Public Library. And as you can see by this article from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, more than 5 tons of material went to that library, to give you a sense of how much he had amassed.
Another St. Louis builder of automobiles known for both their speed and style was Moon. Moon, founded by Joseph Moon. Again, he built for quality, certainly not down to price. The Moons were well known for their shapes and their handling, and of course they were built for the real automotive enthusiasts who could afford to sign the check for them. Moon was so popular and so well designed, we love to use this example of how far that enthusiasm for them reached. The publicist for famous silent screen actress Clara Bow chose a 1919 Moon in 1923. The car was already 4 years old at this point. He chose this car for her on which to pose wearing her Hollywood baseball uniform. It's hard to see in the shot, but the car is wearing California plates with Hollywood hung underneath. So we love to point to the style of the Moon. It was good enough for Hollywood and good enough for Clara Bow. Moon, unfortunately, met a very unpleasant end near the beginning of the Great Depression. To make a long story a little bit shorter, Moon, before it closed, built other great lines, including the Windsor and Diana. When a company outside of St. Louis came in, tried to take it over, things kind of came to a crashing halt, and they ended with Carl Burst, the then president of Moon, and several of his high-ranking officers locked in their office one day trying to really hold down the fort. It didn't work. Unfortunately, Moon went under. It declared bankruptcy in 1931, and as you'll see here in the stock certificates, there's an allusion to its stock and bankruptcy. Moon actually still holds the national record for the longest bankruptcy in U.S. history. That bankruptcy filed in 1931 was not completed until, and I think, Tom, it was 1966?
That's right.
So there's an unfortunate record for Moon. Moon continued to live on, though, in the hearts of automotive enthusiasts and St. Louisans themselves. You can see here in this shot the Moon ride out at Six Flags, one of the most popular and long-lasting rides out at Six Flags. When the ride was disassembled, a couple of the cars did survive, but many people remember riding the Moons at Six Flags back in the day.
And the third of St. Louis's little three manufacturers was Gardner. And as with Moon, they started out building buggies, and you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, Russell Gardner, an early banner buggy ad, Russell Gardner, the founder of the company. Russell Gardner became very, very wealthy at building buggies, and then being involved with the building of Chevrolet, and finally creating his own car company, the Gardner Motor Car, and you can see in the center an ad for one of his cars. Russell Gardner was a very prominent St. Louisan, became very wealthy, and as the Post-Dispatch said, he was so rich you could hear the money jingle when he goes by.